Hi, welcome to the Nasty, Brutish, and Short podcast. I'm Taylor Potts.
I'm Parker Gunderson.
Vicente Gallardo.
And today we'll be talking about OnlyFans. What is it? How does it work in the general scheme of sex work in the porn industry? And also just kind of what are our general thoughts about it? Because this is a pretty complex and interesting topic that intersects with a lot of things like economic status, feminism, even racial issues we think tie into this. This would be a fun discussion. So to start off, first going to kind of go over what OnlyFans is. I'm assuming most people know what OnlyFans is, but just in case, it's essentially like an app in which, like, it's like a Patreon for pornographic content. Like, an individual has, like, tiers that you can pay money for and subscribe to, and those tiers get you certain privileges or access to certain explicit content or other, like, content such as that. I've seen some people using it in other ways, not explicitly porn, but that is the majority of the site. And it's really kind of blown up actually because of the pandemic. It was founded in 2016, but gained popularity after a lot of people got out of work because of the pandemic and were looking for alternate means to make money. And also a couple celebrities got on the map. I believe Bella Thorne and Ansel Elgort and a few other people kind of drew attention to it. So that is kind of a basic rundown of what OnlyFans is. Do you guys have anything to add on to that description?
I will say that my primary knowledge of OnlyFans has been from like the YouTube meme community. It definitely has become a pop culture phenomenon in that sense, and like a lot of attention that really is drawn to OnlyFans has been the steady build-up by other platforms. It's primarily been large creators, talking about it. It's become like a fun video thing to do a video about it and to subscribe to an OnlyFans and tell your viewers what's on it. I think that quite a bit of that is where the vast majority of people really first see OnlyFans, as opposed to going out directly.
Yeah, that's probably my first exposure as well, is through YouTube memes. I haven't done extensive research on it, but I thought that it posed some interesting concepts that are worth talking about. When Taylor and I were first talking about doing a podcast together, I had suggested this topic, but it's more of her sort of domain. So I'm interested to hear what thoughts come out of this.
Yeah. A couple of the things I forgot. One, there is a tipping mechanism. So yes, you pay money for the specific tier you're in, but you can also tip that person individually. And also you're paying for that individual's content, which is different from traditional porn, in which case you're just buying a film. Or, I guess, if it's not 1970, you go into Pornhub and you look for something, you look for a category or something, so it's different in that aspect. I'm also seeing a lot of people using TikTok as a way to direct to OnlyFans. There's several female creators that I followed, and still follow, and they're, in their bios would have, oh, hey, this is my normal content, by the way, if you guys want, here's a link to my OnlyFans where I post explicit content, and I've seen that kind of increase recently, where a lot of creators have their pretty standard TikTok content, and then they're oh, hey, if you also want this, I have an OnlyFans, go click on it if you want. Which is kind of interesting, given the target demographic of TikTok versus the target demographic of OnlyFans. And last thing to note, too, it is owned by a man. I think that kind of factors into, I guess, feminist discussions. A man does profit off of this app. A man invented this app. So that has some interesting connotations to it, but I'm not sure how much we'll necessarily delve into that, but just that's kind of something to know when talking about OnlyFans.
And I do think to know as well in context, OnlyFans is definitely not the first program of its type, nor will it probably be the last. It has just been that OnlyFans has been the most popular, and yes, conveniently aligned with the pandemic to gain popularity.
The only thing I want to just introduce, you had sort of a short history of, I guess, the oldest profession.
Yeah.
So I want to hear about that. I read some of the articles that you linked us. Maybe we'll put that in the podcast link.
Yeah. So I thought it was kind of important when talking about OnlyFans to talk about sex work more broadly and how it starts. And just a disclaimer, this is mostly my knowledge about how prostitution sex work works in kind of the US, Canada, and Europe. I don't have tons of spec knowledge into how prostitution looked throughout places like Africa, Asia, South America. So this is not speaking to that experience, and it's not something I've done a ton of research on right now. So keep in mind, this is mainly European and North American cultures, excluding Mexico. From that, so just keep that in mind when talking about this. So the oldest profession kind of has an interesting start. It's very different than what we think of today as modern sex work or modern prostitution, wherein most women actually worked in bordellos or brothels, in which case they actually lived in a house together and worked in a house together. There was often a madam of the house who was the lady who kind of ran the day-to-day business. She was the administrator, sometimes the owner, and oftentimes the building itself was owned by another owner. Sometimes the madam built the building and was the administrator, but these women would go out, engage in sex work, prostitution, and then would give a portion of the money that they made back to the bordello owner, essentially, in exchange for shelter, food, the other amenities that they lived in, and that continued for a really long time. Some countries did try to crack down on prostitution, but they were mainly toothless legislation. Bordellos have always found ways to exist and existed pretty prevalently throughout Europe, whether or not they were actually, legal, because oftentimes, when the law enforcement is sleeping at your bordello, they don't really want to close it down, despite whatever the leader in power says. And that kind of changes when we get to modern sex work, when prostitution and bordellos are actually banned. We see this in the US, around the turn of the century. Prostitution is made illegal, and these brothels really are cracked down upon, at least in the US. And that leads to an interesting change in how we view sex work, because it, instead of women living in bordellos, it instead becomes women working on their own, acting as escorts and working individually. Oftentimes, these are people who are in, extreme economic hardship. These often, even throughout history and in modernity, these aren't ladies who, prostitution wasn't their main goal in life. This was not ideal, but it is a way to maintain food, to maintain shelter, and is a way you can survive. And in modernity, a lot of women who work in sex work do struggle with alcoholism, drug addiction, and things like that, and this is also a way for them to fund those things. And that is the major difference in modernity, is kind of women working individually instead of with larger organizations. And this actually has been pretty much to women's detriment, because when a woman goes missing when she works at a bordello, it's known about because the madam realizes that she's missing and that she is no longer returning back to the house. Whereas now, if a prostitute goes missing, it could take days or weeks before anyone notices. So it is from that point, and that kind of lone lady of the night, that transitioned to kind of the porn industry itself, which is an entirely new version of sex work that occurs when we gain video cameras and the kind of porn age of the 60s booms and people start filming and distributing pornographic content, which, again, radically changes how people perceive porn. Is a lot more accessible when you can go to an adult video store and just get a VHS tape, or get whatever else you would like, or now you go to Pornhub and you type in whatever you want for free, I think. So it's just, that is kind of how it works now. So that is a very, very brief history of sex work. Do either of you guys have any questions or comments on that history, if I missed anything?
I do have some weird kind of Catholic tangents to go on.
Oh no.
Oh no. Just to kind of differentiate the broad basis of how sex work was viewed in broad society. Because you have great theologians of the Catholic Church, like Thomas Aquinas, who actually support sex work and claim that it is an avenue to keep the rest of society moral. That basis and that thinking, I think it's also important to highlight, at least in the United States, with our taboo and our general attitudes around sex, are all primarily rooted in Protestant values and Puritan ideas. Whereas in Europe, for the vast majority of it, and the reason that in a lot of European countries sex work was never even made illegal, you have some underlying religious attitudes and the ways in which they view it that are fundamentally different. I think in terms of sex work, it's important to understand that the United States is kind of the extreme outlier in terms of the United States has routinely shown a willingness to legislate morality, i.e. prohibition, i.e. the temperance movement, i.e. the list goes on, and a lot of other countries do not necessarily see sex work as their place to legislate. Well, while they may manage it like an industry, they manage it not for the morality of the fact, but insofar as it's an economic institution. I do think that difference is kind of important to make, just because it does kind of give a basis for our cultural attitudes about sex work and sex education.
Yeah, on that point, I think it's interesting you had this in the notes of the podcast, but I definitely feel that sex work is predominantly focused on lower/working classes in terms of who's working in it, but also who it's catering towards. The wealthy obviously indulged in prostitution regularly, but that's obviously not where most of their money came from, because it wouldn't be a thriving industry in many different towns. Like, you can't do it just off of noble houses or off of early sort of bourgeois classes. So it's interesting to sort of note that this is really a working class phenomenon, but it's become completely mainstream.
Yeah, and another thing to note too about how the wealthy interact with prostitution and sex work, at least in history, if a nobleman wanted to have a prostitute, he would essentially buy the rights to her exclusively, and she would become a mistress, a paid mistress who received an allowance. And in compensation, he was the only person that was sleeping with her. However, if you worked in a bordello, you obviously served lots of people and you catered to everyone. So that's another distinction too. If you had the money, people would buy mistresses and would pay them allowances to kind of keep them around, which is a very strange and interesting phenomenon. Yes, these men were often married and still paying their mistresses an allowance. I can imagine that was a little awkward, but we don't really see that in modernity because you can't, buy people.
And in the late,
for very good reasons.
In the late 1490s, yes, one of those same ladies was the mother of Pope Alexander VII's 3 illegitimate children, as the Spanish know as well. So we see that in a lot of different contexts, not just with married men, but also popes as well. Quite a few of them partook in that.
Well, worth noting, Theodora of Byzantium, basically a ruler at one point, was a prostitute prior to marrying Justinian. I don't know if we want to get into sort of arguing/discussing about OnlyFans, but I can definitely see some sort of relation between that class movement.
Yeah, that's super interesting. So I think before we can get into discussion of OnlyFans, I do want to highlight though the difference in what we consider modern sex work and OnlyFans, because I think the concept of being a cam girl is pretty prevalent and was pretty prevalent in the early aughts. And kind of through the 2000s as people were looking for alternatives for sex work, right? Because sex work is quite dangerous, and a lot of women do end up either sexually assaulted, abused, kidnapped, or trafficked in a lot of cases. So camgirling became a quote-unquote safer alternative, in which case you could produce content and be paid from within your own home, and that is what leads to OnlyFans. But I think OnlyFans is very unique in the fact that you are paying for the individual's content. Instead of looking for porn more broadly, you are looking at a specific individual and seeing, I would like to see explicit content of you specifically, which to me is really different than anything we've seen in prior time periods, and I think is something that is a direct result of us having access to the internet, to everyone essentially being able to set up a film or photography studio in their own homes, because we all have phones and cameras and laptops, and we have that technological capability that kind of provides for the uniqueness that is OnlyFans. And as we talked about earlier, OnlyFans really benefited off of the pandemic as well. It's been around since 2016, but when a lot of sex workers could no longer meet with people in person for fear of contracting the disease, they had to look for alternate means of making money, or even just kind of the standard person who had never done sex work before and needed to make rent or needed to be able to pay for groceries, so they also turned to OnlyFans. And I think that becomes really prevalent in kind of what coalesces down to OnlyFans and how it has become kind of the broader cultural phenomenon.
Well, something else that I think should be a distinction between classical sex work and modern sex work is just the invention of photographs. Because before, looking at actual pictures of naked women wasn't an option to the same extent that it is today. Because before you had drawings, there's that famous Japanese early hentai or whatever of the fisherman's wife or something like that. But all you could get was drawn images before, so there's sort of an odd evolution that gets brought in when you get this very visual effect versus rather a physical service.
And also, part of the reason of popularity for the moving picture shows, as created by Thomas Edison's, was porn. A lot of people just made peep shows and porn using the brand new moving picture technology, which is hilarious to think about. That was one of the main reasons it rose to such popularity, because so many people had a desire for, like, visual porn that it created a market and allowed this invention to boom, which is hilarious.
And I think to break it down philosophically as well, what is porn on a fundamental base? Because I think that we haven't even really settled on an active definition as a society of porn. Like, obviously we have things that we constitute as hard versus soft porn, but even in moralistic standards, have you ever heard the Catholic Church's official definition of what porn is? Because it's any piece of media that is intended to arouse. Any piece of media.
Well, that's
a book, a novel, anything. So, like, the whole definition of porn is just so nebulous. And even legally, I forget what Chief Justice, when they were first debating about that, they asked him, well, what is this? And he says, I don't know what it is, but I know it when I see it.
Wasn't that Chief Justice Roberts?
I believe it was Roberts. And that, so legally, even in the United States, we have such a waffly, nebulous definition of what porn actually is. So much of this stuff is just so incredibly, like, relative to what we think anything.
Benny, can I just really clearly ask you to define that more specifically when you talk about the arousal aspect of it? Because are you talking about purely sexual arousal, or can it be other forms of arousal? Like, if I'm emotionally aroused by a book, or if somebody is aroused by, like, violence in an action film, does that count? Like, it stirs you up, or is it just, like, literally you get an erection?
No, it is. Yeah, it is, because in the Church's Latin, I forget what the word is. There is one word that specifically means sexual arousal. And so that is essentially what it is any work, piece of media that is intended to arouse. But how can you tell what the intents of a creator were?
And also, what if you are aroused by something not intended to arouse? Like, what if you just have a weird fetish to every other person, a non-sexual piece of media, but that arouses you? Does the Catholic Church then call that porn?
Well, what are the intentions behind it? Exactly. So like, when we look at these topless classical paintings, and we're like, well, hell, the creator never intended for us to be aroused, but a person might be. Does that constitute pornography?
I think that's really interesting, just to bring in, like, a piece of media that I know we've all watched, and I've enjoyed, and Taylor has appreciated.
Oh no.
Gaspar Noé's Climax. The name of that film is literally Climax, but it's so horrific in a certain sense. Like, there's lots of overtones of sexuality in it. But is that the sort of arousal that would warrant pornographic depictions? I know other films he's made would definitely cross that border much more easily, but Climax for me is sort of borderline, because it's a mix of horrific violence with sort of this sexual weirdness that's going on.
It is. But I do think an important thing to tack on that is clear is consent when it comes to porn. Obviously, if you're not consenting to being videoed or photographed, that is, like, assault. That is not porn. That is a person, like, committing a crime. Porn is consensual for you to be involved in and for you to be viewed upon. So I think that is the one, like, concrete thing that I see about porn, is that it must be consensual, elsewise it is just illegal activity and is not porn. It should not be considered porn.
And I think there's a couple, like, interesting pinpoints, at least that have broached popular culture regarding porn and, like, ethics within making porn. Because I know this because one of my favorite rappers, St. John, made a song called Tracy Lords. And I had to look it up to see what that was actually about. Well, it turns out that Tracy Lords was actually one of the early porn stars in the 80s and 90s, but it actually turned out that she had fraudulently lied. She was 16. Every single one of her videos contained a minor, and it got the entire porn industry into real hot water because it was a minor. And so with that, the porn industry itself has had way more of an emphasis about age than that. And I do think that what we tend to underestimate with the standard porn industry is definitely ties to child trafficking around the world. And that it is so far beneath the surface that we don't really think about it. But a lot of these industries are not as clear-cut as they like to make themselves seem, nor are they as good of actors as they like to make themselves seem. And I think that brings up a very interesting thing, specifically with OnlyFans, like we're trying to talk about, and that's the agency point that I know that we've kind of talked about in other conversations and stuff, and I think naturally that's going to come up. But the other point that I was thinking is because I did see an article on my newsfeed pop up today about Mia Khalifa and her regret for entering into porn, and how she was pressured by various directors, various producers to produce porn, and how that just has had a negative effect on her life, and now she believes that she will never be able to live that down. That kind of coercion into doing something, I do think, also leans heavily into the ideas of consent in porn. Yeah, the contemporary porn industry has definitely shown itself to be very coercive in nature, and I don't necessarily think that goes away with any type of porn that we make. But OnlyFans and this sort of subscriber-based third-party porn does seem to be providing a way that is a lot less coercive on face value.
See, on face value, I would argue that agency is like the major crux of OnlyFans. I think it's a false form of agency when we get into OnlyFans, and I see this through a couple major lenses. Like, I do definitely agree, you don't have like a studio producer actively coercing you to do things you don't want to do, but if it's seen as an easy way for you to make money and you are struggling to make rent payments or car payments, how much choice do you have in exploiting your own body if that is an avenue that is available to you? Is that a free choice you're making, or are you just deciding to do something because you have to do it? Like, I've definitely made jokes about making an OnlyFans before, but if it was the difference between me not being able to eat and be able to get groceries and putting out explicit content online, I would absolutely make an OnlyFans to make money, even though I probably would not like doing it. So, like, how much of a choice really is there when it's so, like, economically
some
driven?
Marxian analysis. We are coerced into work of any kind. We are coerced by society's setups and perceptions of what we believe work to be, right? If you want to borrow that sort of analysis, work is inherently coercive.
I've been set up so explicitly for this, but can I pull us back just for a second? Are either of you familiar with August Ames?
Yes, I am.
No.
Okay, well, I'll just explain really quickly for Taylor and the listener. August Ames was a porn star who ended up killing herself after she got kind of hate mobbed on Twitter for refusing to perform a shoot with a gay actor. At least that's the most explicit reason for it. It's a very complicated story, but it's difficult to ignore that in some part of the porn industry it's kind of impossible to be that sort of person who just chooses who your actual partner is. Like, you're kind of compelled to take jobs, because if you're known as somebody who's difficult to work with or who's not willing to work with actors, you're going to find it much more difficult for directors to pick you up. And then there's your source of livelihood gone. And something kind of insidious about that, and I'm sure we'll touch on this at some point, is that at least in our society, it's difficult for people who have done porn to really move on from that line of work afterwards, because you're, infinitely searchable, and that kind of forever leaves a black mark on your career and your life, that you're seen as somebody who's done porn, and somehow we devalue that.
Yeah, and that's, like, one of my major issues with OnlyFans, too. Like, I absolutely... And by the way, just note that all this is very non-judgmental. Like, we aren't passing judgment on the people who decide to do these things. This is more general thoughts. But, like, again, if you are a person who is using OnlyFans to get through college or get through tough economic times, you only do it for 6 months a year, and then you want to go out and get a career. Like, I want to go into the STEM field. But if it's on my record that I have had an OnlyFans and have done pornographic work online, I will not be hired. Because the rest of the world still does not view pornography and sex work as legitimate work, and is a way for you to not get hired. I think that's, like, a massive problem to consider, like, the actions of a person who does something to get a bit of extra cash, or even does it for a short period of time. Like, that inescapability is a huge problem, especially when employers now like screen your social media and will look you up online to see if you pop up, if anything. And I guarantee you, like, an interviewer would not be happy to find out that a person they may or may not want to hire has like worked in sex work.
Yeah.
And that's a huge problem that I think people are like going to have to grapple with later in life. Maybe not right now, but I think that will be a consequence that comes further down the road that I think is obviously not something that should be happening, but will likely be happening.
Imagine putting that on a resume. I kind of want to jump into the marketing analysis, though. I mean, I talked to Taylor already, but I was really excited to talk about this part of it. So Vinny set me up perfectly. I sort of see OnlyFans as not surprising at all, given the way that so many other parts of social media have evolved, that we've become sort of incredibly distanced from our community. And so we have to sort of seek that through an online medium, which is never really fulfilling, which is why it's done on a payment basis. But I think that it's bad for the women who are doing it, and I think it's bad for the women and men who are doing it. I guess I should be more broad on that. And it's bad for the people who are consuming it. Because I think it's bad for the people who are doing it, because you're literally making your body a commodity. Like, this is exactly what Marx was warning us about, where, like, the person just becomes the commodity themselves. Like, that's not even labor. Because you could labor for quite a long time. Sex work has a definite age limit on it, with, you know, some exceptions, not excluding guilds. Like, at a certain age, you just can't do it anymore. And so one, you get that stigma mark, which means that it's difficult to transition to other forms of work. But the second, you're literally making your body the commodity. So I think that's bad for the person who's producing it. And then for the people consuming it, like, you're paying for communal relationships, which, one, should be kind of a necessity. Like, it's somewhere on the hierarchy of needs, right? And on the other hand, you're paying for something inauthentic. You're essentially using your own work in sort of a hedonistic self-satisfaction to try and... I mean, we talked about this in the last episode, but it's this bridge where you're sort of living out a fantasy because the person's infinitely approachable. Like, nobody that you talk to, like, they're gonna know you on OnlyFans because you're a subscriber, but they're not gonna really care about you in a certain sense. Like, you are to them a customer in the same way that for a large corporation you're a customer. Like, they'll have your name, they'll send you emails with your name on it, but does that really mean anything in this larger context? So you're getting sold this inauthentic experience that I think shades a lot of your, like, the rest of your sexual life and the rest of your relationship life.
Yeah. And I think this also gets uniquely pernicious with the personability of OnlyFans as opposed to other porn. Like, obviously, you know, there are porn stars who are well known, and I'm sure you could look for them if you tried, but it's really not prevalent. But OnlyFans, are paying for the person. And I think that has some really severe consequences for the people who use it, especially women who, like, don't even put out sexually explicit content that get, like, horrifically violent comments all the time on just, like, normal posts, who just want to put up a nice picture that they feel confident about, and guys leave really gross comments. That's not even meant to be explicit content. I cannot imagine the comments and kind of, like, threats of violence that probably exist on OnlyFans, which gets much worse when it is so personal, right? When you know the person is paying for your content and thinks they have total access to you and your body because they are paying for it, which is a massive problem, especially with, like, the prevalence of, like, the kind of the violence we see online. I mean, obviously perpetrated by men and women, but uniquely sexual violence perpetrated by men towards women. I think that's a huge problem with OnlyFans. Like, I can imagine all it takes is one incel-y dude who subscribes to you, and, like, you do something he doesn't like, and he finds out where you live or finds out really personal information that can be used to harm and target you. Like, that's something that could actually happen, and I'm kind of surprised it hasn't happened yet. And that's a major problem, at least for me looking at the platform, is, like, how you grapple with that. Because how do you remove someone for saying something sexually explicit to you when you're putting out sex work, right? Like, I feel like a lot of, like, algorithms and screens can kind of wash their hands of it and say, well, you're putting out sexual content, you consent to this, even though the person may not be consenting to, like, threats of violence against their person.
And I do think that's something that also just, like, is social media in general, right? I do think that a lot of those problems go. But one example that I was specifically thinking about for this podcast that I think is interesting is that of Adam 22. So, a really good pop culture kind of rap podcast is called No Jumper, and it's hosted by Adam22, who is a long-term boyfriend of Lena the Plug, the porn star. And what Adam was talking about on his own podcast as well is that he started doing OnlyFans. They're probably common law married right now, are having a kid together, and are doing OnlyFans together. And it's been a relatively seamless transition for them, as well as it's something that they are both comfortable with as people, and has not drastically impacted their personal lives. And I think within the context of, like, that personal relationship, like, yeah, they were together when she was still in, like, the conventional porn industry, and she still is. But I think that types of transitions in terms of personal agency and, like, having a family life and having, like, something outside of porn is very possible. And I think OnlyFans kind of makes that more possible, but I also do think that it opens up, kind of like Taylor was saying, it opens up then you and your loved ones to that same sort of attack as well. And so, I don't know, I like to grapple with the idea of OnlyFans, because it's an interesting beast. We've never seen anything quite like the popularity that it has, and in the way that it does it. I think that a lot of it is going to be kind of played out with time, and we will really see how this ultimately turns.
How much research did you do for this podcast, or do you just know this many different porn stars?
Well, I'm very into pop culture. I should say that the vast majority of my porn knowledge comes from pop culture. I know quite a bit about it precisely from the No Jumper podcast and Adam22 going into his personal life as well as that. And that's a podcast that I've been following for the rap music content for a very long time.
One thing with what Vinny brought up is I think that it's kind of a weird situation when and with this sort of idea of it as female empowerment or like as a stable relationship, because I feel like OnlyFans in a certain sense is a dependent. Let's generalize here a little bit. I know that it's a mix of men and women, but let's say that women are probably the most popular in general on the site, and that's more particularly what we're focused with, since most of history has been predominantly female, minus maybe the Greco-Roman period. What we get is like this odd thing where it's seen as female empowerment for this sort of sexual liberation that you can like sort of sell your body. But in the same way, I guess I don't get the difference between a dependency on OnlyFans and like a dependency on a husband who's only interested in you and for your body, or maybe like a little bit in your personality. But I with Belle Delphine, for example, we see her playing really heavily into this idea of her as like this little girl that needs to be taken care of, or something like that, or like a submissive person, which is appealing to probably the men who, one, are first off the most likely to stalk you / be creepy. So already there's a big overlap in the demographic between men who your audience is made up of and men who can hurt you or are likely to hurt you. And the second is that you're getting this thing where it's almost like a traditional marriage, but like to many different men who never get the full thing. So it's kind of like you're selling off piecemeal the marriage experience, which I think adds a weird dimension to this that is almost disempowering to women, because they feel like they need to act in a certain way to please their audience or do certain things that please their audience. And I almost see that as more insipid because they totally control their means of livelihood. So it's almost like a return to the 60s and earlier.
Yeah. See, I disagree that you have total autonomy because, as we talked about earlier, in kind of that Marxist analysis of you have to make money. So if your subscribers start asking you for certain content that you may not be comfortable producing and then start leaving en masse, or you're not getting as much tips, what do? Then you have to do those things. Like, I'm not sure how much real choice there is. And also, too, Parker, you hit at the major crux that has been at, like, the center of feminism for literally forever of, bodily autonomy and sexual liberation. Like, I remember, I need to look up the exact quote, but essentially it was a woman discussing whether or not she would rather be living in prostitution or be married, and those were her alternatives. And she said, I would prefer to be owned by one man than be owned by many, because then I know who owns me. And it's obviously like a heartbreaking quote to think about. Think about that idea of ownership. And, like, is self-sexualization liberation? is it something we should support? Like, it ties in ideas, too, of choice feminism, right? If a woman is happy on OnlyFans, should we let her continue OnlyFans? Or, if OnlyFans, like, harms women on whole, should we actively discourage women from doing OnlyFans? Because, yes, it's their choice to do it with their body, but they are doing a disservice to women on whole, which, again, is, like, another major crux of OnlyFans and feminism on whole, and that question is still yet to be answered, because obviously it's very complex and is obviously different from person to person.
That introduces some interesting factors, because obviously some of the people who are using the site are making pretty extravagant sums. One of the articles you listed somebody making $50,000 a month, so $600,000 a year, which is not a meager income by any means. The problem is that I feel like it's difficult to sort of diversify in that fact. And given my economic leanings, like, obviously no labor should be so central to your life that you can never give it up, because that's how you basically lead to sort of wage slavery, because you're just reliant on the income. And at that point, anything that you do to upset your income is something that could really have detriments on your life. Like, you could lose your housing, you might not find a job, and it's even more strong in this particular trend with an increased risk, because we already talked about this black mark thing that you get. So it's difficult to say that these women have any consent, because if you piss off your fans too much, then you lose your base, and then where are you left with? If you can maintain that anonymity, that's great. But I don't think the internet is trending towards increasing anonymity. I think it's trending towards increasing sort of disclosure of who you are. I think it's much harder to remain anonymous on the internet than it was before. People, and especially if you're popular, like the OnlyFans producers who are getting most popular, one, if they're at the top, they probably have already shown who they are. It's hard to have that sort of disconnect. I feel like we as people sort of need to have a face to match to the voice, the body, or whatever. So that's one difficult aspect of it. But the second is that, like, if you have dedicated quote-unquote fans, then they're really willing to sort of search you down. Taylor's already brushed on this sort of stalking that happens from it. It's like an odd voyeuristic thing in that it, like, goes beyond the lens of voyeurism, because it's self-insert voyeurism. That's a term I'm coining. But it's that sort of fantasy element that we talked about. But it's literally you putting yourself in the role of their significant other. And so you get a sense of entitlement that is a lot like being married, I think. Because you feel like you're entitled to the, like, sexual gratification that you get from people who are posting on OnlyFans, and that you are supporting them. That's something I've read commonly about Twitch streamers and OnlyFans and whatever, is that by you giving them money, you feel like you are the person supporting them, and that you deserve recognition because of that. And I think that introduces a really dangerous trend, because the people who are dropping large sums on this, I'm just going to say it outright, are probably obsessed with the person they're donating to. Like, I wouldn't give $300 to pretty much anyone, but like, specifically somebody that I wasn't deeply invested in. And so, in a way, they have to pander to not only just, like, their fans, which have some overlap of creepy, but probably specifically to their creepiest fans if they're going to make maximum money. So it's a business model that promotes this sort of stalkerish behavior.
Yeah. This is just me arguing. Like, I just think even in daily life, if you as a woman get branded as a slut, there are severe social consequences with that. I cannot imagine how much worse that gets when you're trying to get into a corporate job, or you are trying to get into a higher level position with higher screening. I absolutely do think there's a black mark that comes with that. That's why it's so hard to leave sex work. And that's why, like, oftentimes prostitutes who've, like, been arrested especially cannot leave prostitution, because no one will hire them. And no one will even want to touch them with a 10-foot pole because of that social stigma that's so prevalent, at least in the United States. As I said, too, like, I'm a person who's going to be going to academia. I don't think I'd ever be able to get a single job if I decided to do OnlyFans, because it just wouldn't be acceptable for an academic to have that kind of record that was so easily searchable. Like, I try to even think of, like, individuals who moved on past pornography, and I really can't think of that many.
Yeah, and there's a totally different aspect of this. I'm not saying they can never get employed ever again, But that shouldn't be the goal for them to just enter the workforce, right? I don't think it's an outrageous claim to say that people who do prostitution or stripping or any kind of sex work don't make, like, a pretty reasonably high income from it. Like, it's a pretty highly sought after commodity to a certain extent. I mean, I'm sure you could list, a number of actors getting underpaid for it, or a number of performers getting underpaid. But, like, at a certain point, if you've been working in the sex work for a while, you're probably pretty good at it, and you probably can charge a premium, right? So you become accustomed to that level of income. So if I went from making, let's just throw out the number I gave earlier, $600,000 a year, am I really going to be willing to work for minimum wage? Or am I slightly above minimum wage? After leaving that lifestyle, it's not even affordable at a certain point. They, unless they paid off, a mortgage on their house or something like that, then they have to do something that makes a similar income. Otherwise, they suddenly become homeless. Or they have to completely downgrade, sell their house, everything like that. So there's a strong incentive to stay in the porn industry as long as possible. In the same way, like any job, there's a strong incentive to stay in it as long as possible. But you have this insidious sort of part to it, where there is really an age limit on it, for most people, with very few exceptions. I don't know that I could name a single porn star or anybody like that, anybody who does sex work, who has transitioned to becoming, highly successful in a different field. I'd be surprised if you could name somebody. I'm sure there are examples out there, but it seems like something that either you have to marry into richness while you're still in the industry, so like the person on your podcast that you were talking about, or you're getting exploited for a long time and then you're just shit out of the industry. And I don't see how that could have possibly good intentions, especially when with something like OnlyFans, which is accessible to everybody. I mean, we could talk about the porn industry in general, which is, always looking for as young as possible so they can have a long career in porn. But with OnlyFans specifically, because it's become a little bit more socially acceptable, you have to consider the perspective of somebody who's a dumb teenager, like I'm sure we all were, looking at the amount of money and the amount of fame that the people are getting from posting naked pictures of themselves. And we have to ask ourselves whether they're really making a rationalistic choice when they decide to put that first video out there, or when they decide to put that first post. Because it's an extremely tempting.
Yeah, and I think, as I said earlier, the main example with that is Mia Khalifa and coming out and talking about it. And I do agree that the success story of Adam22 and Lena the Plug is primarily because they were both established. Adam was a successful journalist in his own right. They both had never once in that relationship was there a doubt over finance, over money, over anything. And I think in terms of that is where your success stories come, is already established people who can bear the brunt of anything that might come.
And speaking of, as Parker talked about age, we can transition to another kind of controversy we're seeing with OnlyFans is the age of people producing content. It is becoming an increasing problem in which 16 or 17-year-olds, which is under the age of consent in the United States, are putting out pornographic content, which is legally child pornography. And OnlyFans, up to, even currently, isn't really doing much about it. They're not really screening the people that are putting out content, and they're not really doing a ton of work to, ensure that the people posting or even joining their site are actually at the age of consent, which I think is another major problem we're seeing with OnlyFans. Because, that exacerbates what Parker talked about. You're not an 18-year-old making a stupid decision, you're a 16-year-old making a stupid decision, which only seems like 2 years, but, my intelligence was vastly different between 16 and 18. And two, that runs into severe legal issues with people actually putting out child pornography when they are not even adults.
And something to kind of go along with that, since we're talking about the age of consent here. So I think that there's a lot of other factors of consent that play into this. I mean, the age part is definitely the hardest, because, we're not even really developed until we're 27. At least, some studies I've seen have told me that. Who knows? I'm pop psychology, whatever. How much can we really be asked to make informed, rational decisions when there's, tons of media hype around this? This year, like, was the first time I've heard of OnlyFans, and I feel like I hear it at least once a day. So you're getting constant exposure, especially with like this TikTok targeting that Taylor was talking about. So that's one risk with the age element. The other is if you have made your entire life's earnings off of selling your body either physically or, you know, in sort of a theoretical way by posting pictures and videos of yourself, at what point can you reasonably call a cutoff, right? Because if, you know, it's all just one step up, because you could start posting basically like just cute pictures of yourself, I'm assuming. Like that's how a lot of Instagram influencers do. And then they get more and more raunchy as you, one, need to like keep your audience engaged, and then two, need to like grow that audience to get more and more mainstream or to try and get more appeal or maximize your money. This line between OnlyFans and prostitution really becomes blurred. Like, how much money is enough for somebody to just have sex with you? You know, I'm sure that there's lots of compelling cases made every day by people who are pushing for this sort of prostitution aspect of it. But I guess the question that I want to pose to you is, or to both of you, where is this line between like sex work that is under the control of the person posting it, so pictures and videos, and prostitution, and two, like, does this road, like, is there something worse about being paid for sex than there is for posting lewds and nudes and whatever? I think the distinction's difficult, and I don't want to cast aspersions on prostitution, because it's had like this rich history and it has predominantly gone for the working class. But it's sort of like, I guess I have a problem with this total commodification of the body, because then it's not just like you are putting things out there for people to watch. You have to actively participate with another person in exchange for money.
To echo the words of our dear Chief Justice, I'll know it when I see it. I think with so many different parts and the messiness of people's personal lives, that to consider this at anything other than a case-by-case basis does it a disservice. I do think that with OnlyFans, with sex work, with everything that we've really talked about today, there is so much to it and so much to unpack that, yeah, I don't know if I would even be comfortable really providing any sort of line, because it is, at least in my opinion, it is far too complex for me to offer up like a nuanced opinion that I would feel comfortable with.
I'm gonna be mean and press you on this, because I don't think that's in line with morality to do case-by-case morality. Like, there's some need for like specifics, but I think the general rules are how we come to a moral basis. And I think you can put them into broad swaths, right? So I mean, obviously I think we can all agree that underage sex work is probably immoral, not to mention illegal. But like, there has to be other distinguishing factors, because we need to consider the sort of system that this is working in, because it is a system that's pushing people towards OnlyFans and sexual work. Like, it's either the economic system or the social hype around it, or the parasocial relationships that are pushing people to subscribe to it, because it obviously couldn't exist if there wasn't a business for it. So, like, where should these cutoffs be for our society between economically exploiting people and using them as means to get to sexual gratification and, like, healthy expression of sexual autonomy and body imagery?
Parker, I'm going to argue you on this. So this is also, too, where this isn't analyzing under-choice feminist theory. Because I have been pretty critical of OnlyFans, but this is honestly my main argument in my head for it, because I do have pretty complex feelings about it. So when you talk about commodification of bodies specifically, and where do you draw the line? To me, at least, and to most women that I interact with, we don't feel as if we own our bodies, right? Catcalling begins at the age of 10, 11, 12, and continues, most women oftentimes experiencing either microaggressions or outright harassment and assault. But if you told me I could earn money off of sending people nudes or off of sexually exploiting men who have spent their whole life commodifying me, you know what, I'm gonna make money. And I can absolutely see how a beginning of sense of self-ownership comes from that, and comes from that idea of, if I am going to be looked at as a sexual object, as pretty much any woman is in modern society, why not make money from it? Why not exploit men's tendencies to sexualize me? Because I already don't feel like I own my body in a daily context, right? Might as well make some money off of it, might as well support myself, and I don't particularly care if the guys I'm interacting with aren't getting great social interactions, because for all I care, they're paying my bills, I'm making money, and to me, there's not any really extreme harm done, to me at least, because for a lot of women, this is just kind of the status quo, but now you get paid when a guy looks you up and down instead of just feeling gross.
I don't know if I misunderstood your point, or I wasn't particularly clear. Like, my conceptualization of how OnlyFans and prostitution sort of functions just as a market interaction is that the woman becomes the product, and is...
Yeah.
So, I guess I'm confused about where you're saying that the men's sexual gratification doesn't matter. Because that seems like that's what they're paying for, basically.
So... again, kind of going into that choice feminism analysis, essentially saying it doesn't matter to me, the woman, so long as they pay me, right? Like, these are already men who are going to have sexually explicit thoughts about me, want sexually explicit interactions with me, as long as they're continuing to pay me, I don't particularly care, because these are things they likely would already be doing, but now I am profiting and I am able to exploit that sexual attention and attraction. That's what I mean when I say that, like, I as the content producer don't care about their sexual gratification so long as I am profiting off of it.
Okay, that introduces to me some complex feelings, namely in the way, like, we can say that OnlyFans is sort of more detached from a corporate entity than, like, Pornhub is or whatever. But it's not like they're in control of it. Like, you're not marketing directly to the consumer. It's kind of like being a brand that's selling on Amazon, or like you're being licensed by a company, like for your music or something else. So I think that the very presence of the middleman would sort of deter that fact. Like, you can say that you're making money from it, but you're not in control of it.
Yeah, but again, that kind of ties back into choice feminism, and I think, too, like, kind of that weaponized femininity that you saw a lot of in the 90s, that for better or for worse, yes, there's a middleman, but to me at least, in like a theoretical sense, makes me feel more empowered, because I am exploiting the platform and the men to my advantage. That's kind of how I see this, as kind of a theoretical and more like feelings-based approach to your thoughts about yourself and towards like your work when you are participating on OnlyFans.
Okay, this might be maybe a question that's not particularly informed, because I'm not as informed as you on feminism, but would you see women as just a composite of individuals or as a collective?
Define the difference between those.
Well, so like, is it a movement that just a bunch of individual women who just happen to share, or women that just happen to share, that they have the same gender? Or would you say that feminism has a life on its own, outside of just the people who make it up? Because we talk about these waves, so that would imply to me that there's a movement that can exist on its own.
I do think feminist movements exist on their own, because I don't think you can totally operate under the idea of shared gender, especially when you look at how race interacts with gender. White women, yes, are oppressed because of their gender, but they also are privileged because they are white, and the advantages that come along with that. And it has taken a long time for women of color to be intersected into the feminist movement on whole, which I think is obviously a fantastic thing. We should be supporting all women. But I do think it's a movement in and of its own that has disagreements within itself, right? There's obviously a lot of tension between choice feminism and like other more restrictive and less accessible forms of feminism that says if this harms women on whole, you shouldn't do it, even if it makes you personally happy. Like, I think that is indicative of like a larger social movement that has conversations about the way it should move forward, the political actions it should take, and how it interacts on a daily basis. And I also think feminism, whether or not you are a feminist, does interact with your life, regardless of your gender, right? The fact that I can have a credit card is a result of, like, feminist actions taken in the 60s, right? And there's a slew of other things that, you know, have affected my life, even if I would not call myself feminist, like, in a hypothetical sense, right? So I think that's also indicative of, like, a larger movement that surrounds feminism and surrounds like ideas of gender equality.
Okay. Yeah, in that part just now, I think you identified my sort of key confusion that I'm having with this idea of choice feminism versus feminism on a whole. Because I don't want to overstate it, but it does seem kind of like women who are using OnlyFans and pornography are, to some extent, kind of undermining the movement from my perspective. While it's beneficial to them, it does create these stereotypes, and it also creates the sort of phenomena that we were talking about earlier with underage girls posting to it. Because if you sell this idea of a glamorous lifestyle that we've already kind of talked about the relationship between how OnlyFans is sort of marriage by piecemeal, it seems to be selling them a very sort of depressing return to form for gender relationships. So while it could benefit individual women, to me it sort of seems like it's bad for the movement as a whole.
I mean, I personally agree with you. I think there are obviously people who disagree that any economic empowerment of women is better for the movement as a whole, but you've identified kind of, again, the central issue of feminism. There's different theories, there's different ideas of how we should move forward, and that's a contradiction that feminism has always grappled with and is still grappling with, and I think that's also a lot of the discussion that surrounds OnlyFans. Like, it's great that you are receiving benefit, but is it worth the cost of disadvantaging, of stereotyping, and of harming other women who are not as successful in the platform or who do not wish to enter the platform? So I don't have an answer to that question, because that's a broader discussion, right, among feminists, among women, and is kind of how the movement has always been this constant push and pull between, should we just let women choose to do what they want to do, and that is liberation, versus I would probably more along the lines of Simone de Beauvoir's theories of we should ask women to do certain things because that is better advantageous to all women. And I think that's absolutely present in OnlyFans too. It's just a really broad discussion, and there's not an easy answer for how to deal with ideas of patriarchy and misogyny, and different people have wildly different experiences that all tie into those things. And I still don't think the movement has quote-unquote decided upon the model of feminism that it wishes to move forward with in discussing that. So there's not really an easy answer to that question, I guess. That's my cop-out answer. Is fem theory is, oh god.
Yes, to try to defend, can you remind me, Parker, what morally do you want me to say? You're trying to back me into a corner and defend a view, which, as we know, I have none. So, can you...
I suppose in a broad sense I'm trying to get you to defend Kantian,
oh god, no.
Yes, and that's what I thought, because insofar as that...
We shall not speak of his name here.
I guess, to just predicate to the listeners, my standard cop-out answer will just be falling back into Catholicism. And just the worldview predicated in terms of that. Parker, I do think that sexual morality and the ways in which we perceive sex have so fundamentally changed throughout history that our modern times is nothing more than a microcosm of the totality of the ways that humanity has viewed sex. Insofar as that exists, I do not think... While we have agreed on some things, right? I think that the vast majority of people do take problem with things i.e. bestiality, i.e. pedophilia, and a myriad of other things that we would consider over the top. There's not a whole lot of agreement throughout history on how we view sex. And I think that specifically in the United States, we've been blinded by the fact that we've had a history of 200 years of just broad Puritan worldview so thoroughly pounded into our heads that we fail to consider the totality of the history. And so insofar as that exists, that's where I justify me not taking the stand, is that I think there's far more nuance there than our society permits us and allows us to.
Well, I can agree with you that sex seems different, but I think that it is broadly related to things that Taylor brought up in her introduction, but also I think it's strongly tied to just pornography in general, and I don't want to blow this topic up to all of pornography, even though we've been kind of touching on it. I think that could be a topic in and of itself, but I think that when we're sort of looking at moral ethics, we do need to consider, first off, what I think that we've moved to a largely consent-based model for how sexual relationships should go. And I think that a damaging part of the internet is that you only get consent at the first step, and that's the decision to post or not to post. And sometimes you don't even get that, right? Because you can have nudes leaked or whatever that's happening. But so there's a fundamental issue with that. We're not in line with the values that we're holding to be the highest, and so that's one problem I have with it. And the second is that I don't think this will be controversial, but I think that consent is honestly just impossible in some cases, like with people who are underage. Or animals, which are the two examples that you brought up. So I think that what is going to be the process or the dialectic for like all of sort of contemporary history of sexual relations is going to be finding a finer and finer mesh for where this borderline between consent and non-consent lies on issues surrounding the internet. Like, is it consensual to sell your body for economic prospect? Because there's clearly an incentive, and that takes away some options. Because if you're poor and you have to choose between selling your body or starving, like, there's an easy answer there, right? I don't know that we can't say that there's not a sort of bright line on this where we can say this is bad and this isn't bad. I think that it's there. I think it's going to be a fine one, and there's going to be like a difference of like a half step, right, between what is okay and what isn't.
Yeah,
okay.
and that's.
But I think it's possible to find.
That's what I guess is my problem with trying to highlight a bright line, because at least theologically, the Catholic Church has still not made up its mind. Well, has kind of made up its mind about whether or not sex is actually evil, and I think the vast majority of like religions have grappled with that problem, as well as we still don't have like an ideological consensus of anything insofar as that. I don't think sex and issues surrounding sex are any different, and that's where I waffle, and that's where I don't take like a hard stance or a hard right line, because I think it's far too difficult to find, and I guess it's something that at least me personally, I'm not going to try to unpack it, because I do think that a lot of it boils down to a case-by-case basis. I think that our perceptions of sex, what sex means to us, what it does for us as people, and how we interact with sex work is a largely case-by-case basis. And I think that any sort of consensus that we see is just in the numbers of individual cases that like resemble each other. There's too many factors for me. I get overwhelmed.
Okay, well, I think that we've done this topic quite a bit. Taylor, do you want to read us out, give a summary of our findings, present a research paper on the topic, and leave a funny quote like you did on your last podcast?
What funny quote did I leave on the last one?
You have to give me till the third podcast to look stupid.
Well, I think we've discussed a lot of kind of what we wanted to talk about regarding OnlyFans, and also, obviously, this is clearly a much broader topic, but don't want to have you guys listening to discussions of feminist theory and concepts on sex for, 4 hours, because I assume you have slightly more interesting things to do than do this. But we thank you guys for listening to the Nasty, Brutish, and Short podcast. We hope you had a fun time listening to it, and I also hope you were wearing headphones wearing this, because if not, oof, sorry about that one. Have a good night.